Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Francesca Grandi. I work here at IISS as a senior fellow for conflict security and development. With me here is our colleague Antonio Sampaio. He's our in-house expert on urban security and everything Latin America, but especially Brazil and Colombia. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth installment of our monthly conflict briefings. Every month we zoom in onto an armed conflict or armed violence situation, and we ask our experts to walk us through the latest developments and the implications of the violence for broader dynamics. So this morning we're going to talk about Brazil. And we're going to do this, as usual, in the form of an informal conversation. I will ask some questions to Antonio, but then I will leave the floor to you so you will be able to enter the conversation more actively. As you know, the conflict briefings are based on our armed conflict database. So we will show you in the background some infographics which are produced with the data that we collect through the armed conflict database. Antonio is our expert on urban security. As I said, he has written extensively on topics ranging from political to security developments in Latin America. Among other things, has contributed to the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, and the Washington Post. In 2018, he advised NATO on the formulation of a capstone doctrine for military operations in urban environments. Prior to joining IISS, he was an editor at the international desk of Globo News TV in Rio de Janeiro. So without further ado, I will turn now to Antonio and ask him some questions. Good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please walk us through, introduce us to the conflict dynamics in Rio and the actors that are involved and what activities they are involved in?
Yeah, so Rio is has been affected for about 4 decades now, more or less, by a very intense criminal underworld that is characterized by the presence of one big criminal group that has been active since the 1980s, which is called the Red Command. This group, in the past few decades, it has fragmented several times and given birth to some splinter organizations, some of which died down, some of which are still active. And in parallel to this criminal gang dynamic, which I will explain a bit further later, there is also the phenomenon of vigilante militias. So the real media and expert community call them militias, and it means for them a very specific dynamic, which is the groups that emerged in the peripheries and some slums by locals who usually are former or off-duty police officers or military officers that that decided to take up arms and establish vigilante communities. And during the years, especially the past 10 to 15 years, these militia groups acquired quite substantive territorial control, just like the gangs. They tend to operate less explicitly, less visibly with drugs, although there are reports of them operating with drugs as well. But because they were born with this vigilante orientation to protect the communities from the drug gangs, they tend to not allow drug trafficking very overtly in their territories, and actually to punish severely people caught in drug trafficking and drug consumption. So these are the two main categories of non-state armed groups, and the the other conflict actor, which is very important, is the state. Specifically the military police, which is an organization that is officially in charge of ostensive policing, go to the streets, patrol, and to protect streets, and but in truth, in reality, it became the go-to police force to confront the criminal gangs. So every time there is an operation that requires the arrest of a drug gang or a drug gang member or a drug lord, the military police is the usual suspect, the usual actor that is deployed to go to the slums or to a slum, usually through an incursion logic. So because the slums are controlled by these non-state armed groups, the police goes there, the military police goes there with force, and if it is a slum controlled by the Red Command or one of its breakaway factions, which is the Amigos dos Amigos, which means friends of friends, and the third terceiro comando da capital, so TCP. So if it is one of these drug gangs, this intervention usually means a lot of gunfights and a lot of risk to the people who live there and to the police officers themselves. The fatalities involving police members of the police force are quite substantive. There's also a civilian police force, which is also linked to the state government, which technically is more focused on investigations, but as part of this militarization of security interventions in Rio, which we will talk about more later in the event, but the civilian police recently, this year, there was an incident involving a helicopter of the civilian police, which was conducting an operation in the Maré slum, and because they spotted suspected criminals, they opened fire from the helicopter down on the suspected criminals, and a young boy that was going to school, and he was late, so he was very unlucky, and he was shot, and later he died in hospital, and so that showed to a lot of people that there was this unbelievable militarization, that even the civilian police, which was supposed to be more taking care more of investigations, was also heavily militarized. So these are the conflict actors: the non-state, the drug gangs, the vigilante militias, which turned out to become sort of a criminal actor in itself, and the state police forces.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe you can introduce us a bit more to this military intervention.
Yeah.
I know that they changed over the years. Mm-hmm. I also know that you've been in Brazil in around 2015, if I'm not wrong, and you've just been there 3 years after. Yeah. So you have a privileged view on actually how this arch has developed and what the situation is now. And if you mind to share, that would be very interesting. Yeah. So
as part of Rio was chosen. I can't actually remember what year specifically was chosen, but it was chosen during the 2000s to host the Olympics and be one of the cities hosting games for the World Cup. So the state government thought there has to be some sort of policy to try to reduce criminal violence, and at the time, the recently elected government chose a police officer called José Mariano Beltrami, who learned from experiences in the US and to a greater extent in Medellin, in Colombia, and implemented. And it started very experimentally, but later became the pacification strategy which some of you might know through the acronym UPP, which means Pacifying Police Units. So this program was quite simple and at the same time very innovative, because unlike the previous police approaches in Rio, it involved the entrance of the police forces into the slums and the permanent stationing of them there. That was the innovative aspect of it, which sounds quite strange because it's not exactly rocket science, but it was indeed quite new for Rio, this idea that the state had the boldness to stay in slums that have been, for decades, the territories of gangs and other non-state actors. So this started in December 2010. December 2008. And so we're now reaching, I think is on today's the 17th, right? I think it's the 19th officially, that is the 10-year anniversary of the pacification strategy. And I told my colleagues that I'm wearing a tie just because I consider this a funeral for the pacification strategy. But so it started in a small slum in December 2008, and then because it worked in this experimental small territory, it was gradually expanded, including in huge slums like Alemão and Maré and Rocinha, each of which have over 100,000 inhabitants. Rocinha is many people consider it the largest slum in Brazil because numbers are not very well. There are the official numbers, which usually run around 120,000, 140,000 for these slums, but the local communities, the local leadership usually say that the population is much larger. So this program had tremendous success initially. So if we can show, yes, so you can see there that starting in 2008 and especially around 2010, 2011, intentional homicides and the homicides related to police intervention declined quite a lot. And that was mainly because the police and the pacification strategy, they were well-resourced at the time, and there was this huge societal consensus that the program was working and that it was growing. So the military police was having more and more officers, was able to recruit more officers to equip the pacifying units that were established in the slums. And because they were well manned and the program was working for a time, the criminal gangs either fled from the slums at the start of the occupation of each slum, or they lied low. They laid low. So this program, and because the logic of confrontation declined at that time, the program was very successful, and the homicides declined substantively.
But this was the end of 2008, sort of in the course of 2009, 2010. And then what changed?
So in 2015, when I got there, the program was in deep trouble. So the criminal gangs, because the program was, in a way, it was used for political purposes by the state government, because it was the initial implementation was so successful that they decided to expand the program quite a lot. So the rate of police officers per inhabitant, per 100,000 inhabitants in each slum sort of declined. So the program was spread thin. And the credibility of the program in the eyes of the criminal gangs, the deterrence aspect sort of declined. So the criminal gangs started challenging the strategy via what you can call hit-and-run attacks or targeted assassination of police officers, even off-duty and on-duty. So even though the police was no longer raiding the slums and leaving the same day or the next day as it was doing before the program, the logic of confrontation sort of restarted. And so in 2015, the state government, and Beltrami, the father of the pacification, he was very worried. And I spoke to him at the time, and he was trying to get the state government, and he got it, to put the pacification strategy in the constitution of the state of Rio de Janeiro, so that no government would. But that didn't have much practical effect. So the state of Rio, I think from 2014, 2015, started being very severely hit by the downturn in oil prices. Rio is very dependent on oil revenues, so the resources for the pacification sort of stagnated and then declined. So this year, in 2018, and starting in late 2017, was really the end of this narrative that the pacification is actually can remain as it was. So there were in 2017, we reached the height of the number of pacifying police units. That was 37, and then that
37 units.
Units, yes. So that declined. So this year we had seven pacifying police units in slums deactivated, and some others are being merged into other pacification strategies. And the main reason it's astonishing sometimes that the police does not try to hide the fact that it was due to simply military confrontation with the criminals. So the pacifying police units were no longer able to deter the criminals, and they were actually became liabilities. So when the deterrence capacity of the state reduced, the criminals returned, and because the pacifying police unit was supposed to be a more community-oriented policing, it was not equipped to do military confrontation. So when the criminals imposed on the pacified slums this logic of criminal confrontation, the state had to retreat. And another aspect that failed and was very important to reduce the popular support for the pacification was the reduction in the developmental aspects of it. So the pacification had two main streams. One was the police and sometimes military occupation of the slum, and on the other hand, the developmental sort of peace building, institutional building, infrastructure in the slums. This second aspect didn't work out very well, and that was another constant criticism that Beltrami had of the state. Like, we are alone, the police is alone, we are doing everything.
Also tasks that they're not necessarily equipped to do as a mandate in itself.
Yes. So those were the two main reasons. There were a few others, but the reduction in resources and the failure of the developmental aspects of the program.
Sure, thanks. So as a consequence, also confrontations between the armed actors, not the state, but other armed actors in the favelas have increased in the recent years. Do you want to add anything to that?
Maybe no. Just to show that this is reflected in this very good graphic, I think, because it shows more or less the prevailing policy approach to the slums. And since 2012, more or less, because even though the pacification wasn't bad, there was a reversion to this military logic of confrontation, sometimes imposed by the criminals, by the Red Command and the other gangs, and sometimes due to simply a political intention to really show that they were doing something. So this logic of resorting to the confrontation of criminals as a go-to policy in the absence of a broader root cause tackling of the phenomenon has been back.
Thank you. I have one last question, and then I would like to open the floor. So, of course, we have to talk about the new Bolsonaro administration.
Yes.
Because the new president has very prominently promised a tough on crime approach in many different circumstances. So what do you see coming in the near medium-term future?
Yeah.
Is this only rhetoric? Is budget put into the words of the new president? What do you expect, and to what dynamics should we look at in order to interpret if the approach and the strategies are changing or not, and are being effective?
Yeah. So the Rio is one of the states that will feel this new political reality in Brazil more heavily or more directly, because not only it is affected by the hard on crime, sort of hard security approach of Jair Bolsonaro, the elected president, who will be sworn in on the 1st of January, but it has also had a Bolsonaro ally elected as state governor. So his name is Wilson Witzel, and he is, like Bolsonaro, from a very small right-wing party that used to have no political power, really, the broad context of Brazilian politics, but he rose through the very quickly in the polls and surprised everybody with a first round victory and getting ahead on the first round. And then on the second round, he won quite comfortably. And it is difficult to analyze his potential, his risks at the moment, because his communication strategy has been quite lacking, and that's something that many media and academic analysts fail to see, that sometimes some of his most colorful and quite worrying statements may not reflect the full range of policies that he's promising. So what many people have focused on is the fact that he pledged to create elite units of snipers to take on the criminals, and including from helicopters. So many people remember the incident with the civilian police helicopter, and this idea of the police being this sort of military force, raining down bullets on the civilian population. What he says is that this sniper force will be very well trained and a very elite force that will be very precise in its hits, and will target the gang members who are holding rifles. So this long-standing tradition of Rio having this gang territories with gang members in broad daylight holding military-grade rifles, he wants to instruct his police officers to shoot them on sight. And he's a former judge, and he says that this is justifiable, that this would not incur in sort of human rights concerns. Many people think that he's wrong. I think he's wrong. But behind the scenes and more quietly, he has also pledged to implement public-private partnerships to do development in the slums. And recently I read that he also told a news website that he will not do away with the pacification, so he will continue the pacification, even though, like the current governor, he doesn't have any ambitions to expand it or make it great again. So it really is a matter of waiting and seeing what will prevail in this strategy. One thing that I was very disheartened to learn is that he decided to abolish the Security Secretariat, which is the state government body that, as the name says, concentrating the policy making and the policy strategy and planning and intelligence on security matters. So they are in charge of the military police, of the civilian police, and they have a role in coordinating these different forces. And they also play an important role in sort of concentrating information and publishing information to the public. I mean, this can only mean more risks in my view. I mean, there are very few good things that can arise from that. So the signs so far are not very promising, and but there is this faint, this subtle hint towards a more holistic approach to security. So we can hope that this will become more important as time goes by.
Thank you very much, Antonio. I'll open the floor to the audience now. If you can please identify yourself before asking your questions, that would be great. Any questions from the floor, please?
Don't be shy.
All right. Virginia Comoli from the ISS. Thank you very much, Antonio. I wonder whether it would be perhaps useful to everyone to say a few words on how actually Rio de Janeiro ended up in the armed conflict database. This was a decision that was made this year. Mm. Can you talk us through that process so that people can better understand about that?
So the discussion to include the Rio de Janeiro situation in the armed conflict database really goes back to the fact that we've been researching Rio for a while now, and it's very clear, and all the stakeholders in Rio say this very, very clearly, that there is a logic of territorial clashes, of dispute over who governs, who controls territory, at the same time that there are very highly organized non-state armed groups controlling these territories and fighting with themselves and with the state for control. So it fits the current definition that was agreed by the editors of the armed conflict database and survey on the definition of conflict as being this prolonged and sustained combat between organized forces and not necessarily having a political ideology guiding them. So in the case of Rio, you see the word war and the word conflict being used quite frequently by the stakeholders, by analysts, academics, by the police. And there was a former commander of the. Well, to illustrate this further, I will give the example of the elite police squad that is responsible for the invasions of the slums frequently, which is called BOPE, the Batalhão de Operações Especiais Policiais. They were the main characters. I don't know if you've seen this, but there is a good film that I recommend for a better understanding of how this perverse logic of military confrontation works, which is called Elite Squad. So the BOPE is a battalion that has its insignia as a skull with a knife going through it and two guns crossed over a black background. So it gives you an idea of the overtly militarized and the pride that they feel over this approach to the gangs. This has been the force that's been used to occupy the slums and to confront the criminals as they go to theoretically break this territorial control over the slums. So these were some of the dynamics that sort of backed up this decision to include Rio.
So really the organization was very crucial to this.
Yes.
Makes sense. Do you mind, for those of us who are not super familiar with the geography of Rio de Janeiro, to talk us through a little bit through these favelas, where they are, and what is the geography of the city a little bit?
I think we have a map, don't we? Rio, one of the geographic dynamics that support this geopolitics of crime in Rio is the fact that it's a very hilly city, has several hills, and it dates back to the 1980s. 19th century, when the abolition of slavery occurred, and because there wasn't really a housing or employment program for the freed slaves, many of them settled in hills in Rio and other places, but especially in Rio because there are so many hills. And as you can imagine, and in a similar fashion to many other cities in Latin America, these informal communities in hills became slums. They became very large and they grew, and some of them are still growing, many times over protected environmental lands, forests, and so you can see in the map that, especially towards the north, you see Alemão, Complexo da Maré. Those are slums that are very large. Each of them has more than 100,000 inhabitants, and the island that you can see on the north is where the airport is, the international airport. So they are located. As you come out of the airport, you can see that there are some. They are plastic walls. There are walls surrounding the highway that leads to the city from the airport. The government initially justified them as being soundproof walls to protect the slum, but actually many argue that it's the opposite. It's the attempt to protect the eyes of the beholder from the reality of the. So it's a bit poetic, you know. Yeah. So these slums, they are everywhere in the city. There is only one neighborhood in Rio that doesn't have a slum, which is an area located called Urca, located near the military schools, the schools of the armed forces. I don't know if you can see this, but towards the west, you can't actually see this, but somewhere in the west, there is Rocinha, which is located between areas of the south zone, sort of where the middle class and the elites live, and the new sort of development, because Rio is the only area it has to grow is really to the west, the western area, and right at the main highway that leads to this new development, there is Rocinha, and is an area that is very unstable, that has had plentiful cases of gunfights that spilled over into the highway, including a tunnel that is located nearby that is sometimes closed by the criminals to conduct robberies and kidnappings, although kidnappings recently have not been so frequent. So it is a dynamic, it is a geographic dynamic that really spills over. It's not just concentrated in the slums, even though sometimes the elite and the middle classes try to forget about them and live their lives as any person in any city would try to, but sometimes these security dynamics spill over into the broader city and affect the economy. Sometimes businesses have to close, or they have to pay bribes to the criminals.
Thank you for that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Sasha. I'm at LSE. I was just wondering, you mentioned there have been some unsuccessful initiatives for peace building, so I was wondering if that comprised of attempts at peace talks, sort of like thinking about FARC and how far they've come, if there have been similar efforts. And my second question was, it might be a silly question, but I was just wondering what the long-term strategy and aims are of these groups. Like, do they want to expand their control even further, or make increasing incursions on the government? What is their end goal?
Thank you. Two very good questions, especially the one you thought was silly. Simply, peace talks have been a no-go area for Brazil and for the government. There have been suggestions in the past, discussions by NGOs, but not that we know of in terms of attempts to have a peace talk with the non-state armed groups. And in fact, what we have is the opposite. It's a very peaceful talk, but a peaceful talk between corrupt politicians and the criminals, and especially the militias. So there are a lot of people that profit out of this territorial control. So the militias because they emerged with this narrative of being good guys against the bad guys, the gangs. Initially, the politicians in the state and municipal chambers and legislative bodies, they initially overtly supported these groups, these militias, and then in 2008, I believe, there was very high-profile case of them kidnapping and torturing journalists from Odia newspaper. And then the support went to the shadows, but they remain. So what they do is that they profit out of the territorial control that they have by selling to politicians votes, because these slums have a lot of people, and their votes are quite profitable for these militias. They sell to some corrupt politicians this the right, or they allow some politicians or campaigns to campaign in the slums and others not. So they control this, and this is not just being in media reports or rumors. It was actually clearly laid out by Parliamentary Committee of Investigation, as they call it in Brazil, in the state government and in the state legislature, and also by the prosecutor's office. So this is very well documented cases of militias having an effect on politics. So on the long-term strategies, this allows me to say something that I was meaning to. Rio is somehow affected by a broader nationwide dynamic of organized crime in Brazil, which is a nationwide war between the PCC, which is the First Capital Command, the main criminal group based in São Paulo, which is one of the largest organized crime groups in the world, and the Red Command of Rio. So the First Capital Command, to put it very briefly, has been expanding quite rapidly through Brazil, and that has incurred the annoyance or the enmity of some regional organizations that allied themselves to the Red Command. So because of this, the PCC, the São Paulo organization, has been funding the enemies of the Red Command in Rio, which are called ADA, Amigos dos Amigos, and TCP, the Third Command. And recently, the ADA and the TCP have allied. So these organizations, basically what they want is obviously purely commercial, purely material benefits, but there's also the constant struggle for hegemony of slums, and especially the slums that are located near the wealthier areas. So Rocinha is a constant hotspot because it's located near the South Zone. So what they want is the hegemony of the drug selling infrastructure in Rio, but the Red Command also has a nationwide strategy. So Brazil, in frequent documents by the UNODC, the annual drugs report that they do, Brazil has been, for a few years now, one of the main countries of origin of drugs to many regions, Europe, even Asia sometimes, and is a massive drug. It is a very important drug route to Africa and then Europe. The United States has been very active in closing down the drug routes, especially by sea, from South America to the US. So with that, Venezuela and Brazil became very important. So Rio is, and I think this is a relatively new phenomenon, that the gangs in Rio have had more contact and linkage to this national and transnational logic, which can only mean bad news for Rio because it gives them more weapons, more resources to challenge the state.
So actually that links to a question I had just a second. I just wanted to clarify, so that the criminal activities are focusing more and more around the drug trade, right?
Yeah, true. So they finance themselves with drugs. It is not necessarily an obvious thing because if you look at Colombia, some of the organized criminal groups there, they operate quite heavily with illicit mining, minerals and gold. In Brazil, it's still very concentrated in drugs. And in Rio, because the territorial control is so marked and so long-standing, the extortion is also an important profit, especially for the militias. So the militias, because they can't operate overtly with drugs because of their narrative, what they do is that they have a very prolific empire of illicit, basically, which is illicit provision of a number of licit goods and services, such as transportation, unregistered transportation, vans and buses that are operating for the militias, protection money from businesses, provision of several cigarettes and alcohol, and things like that. But extortion is very high.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah. Very good. We have lots of questions. Ladies first.
Oh, great. My name is Rachel. I'm from Moonshot CDE. You mentioned the sudden and phenomenal rise of the far right in Brazil, and also you mentioned how militias have a really large effect on politics in Brazil. So I was quite interested in how these militias and such intense criminal activity has specifically led to the rise of the far right, and also if you would consider far right groups to be a threat in Brazil via the far right groups.
Yeah. For the state of Rio, it is clear that the election of the right-wing candidate Wilson Witzel was predominantly a result of this deterioration of security and the sense that the traditional political elites, aside from being extremely corrupt and caught in corruption by the car wash investigations and other operations to tackle corruption, they have been unable to tackle this problem of security. And the two things go hand in hand, because there is this perception that of a general crisis of leadership and moral values that have led to the weakening of the state. So the two issues of corruption and security are tied together, very closely linked in the campaign messages of the far right, both in Rio and in Brazil. So when we look outside of Rio, the situation is different, varies from locality to locality, but it's actually very similar in the sense of both in the deterioration, in the worsening of security conditions, especially in the northeast of Brazil, but in other areas as well. And also due to the fact that the gangs are very well armed, and even though they don't have the level of territorial control that they have in Rio, they do conduct assassinations. They have occasional gunfights with gangs and with police. So there is a broader national sense that security has been worsening quite severely, and this is obviously the case. This is obviously backed up by the homicide numbers in Brazil that have been rising substantively in recent years, and that has been used by the far right politicians, by Bolsonaro and by the elected governor of Rio, tied to the corruption story. So this sense that the political elites have failed us, and now we have to resort to radical alternatives. Far-right groups in Brazil, I'm not very familiar with this. I'll have to get back to you about this. But I don't have a sense that they have operated very overtly, at least recently. So we have to keep a close eye on that.
Thank you. To the right, please.
I'm Kevin Goff from the Risk Advisory Group. I've got two questions. You talk quite a lot about the militias. I noticed last week that there was another story that came out about an assassination plot against another party member from the PSOL. Does that signal that the militias are sort of changing the way they're becoming more prominent, and the people that are sort of directing them to do these things are changing the way that they're operating? The second question is to do with the military intervention. I understand that Bolsonaro said that he's going to end the intervention next year, but potentially maintain the military in Rio. So what effect is that going to have on security in, the city and the state? And
Yeah. So, good point. The last week there was the report of a death threat against a politician from a far left party called PSOL. The party is PSOL, but his name is Marcelo Freixo. He is a lawmaker in the state legislature, and he received a death threat. And I cannot believe that this was the first one, because he's been leading the Parliamentary Committee of Investigation against the militias for quite some time. This death threat was publicly reported, and it is very clearly an attempt to intimidate him. And this has been a tactic of the militias of political assassinations. And we saw also the high-profile killing of another state lawmaker last year that was assassinated, and we. Even though the investigation over her death is not complete, it is highly likely that it was committed by the militias. Marielle Franco, the lawmaker. So the military intervention. The federal intervention that is currently in place, which also I didn't mention. So Rio is currently under a federal intervention since February 2018, which means that the military has control over all security institutions in Rio, including the police, the fire brigades, etc. And this was established after some high-profile robberies and cases of violence during Carnival, which is a very important holiday and touristy season for Rio. In practice, it has not meant a tremendous difference in terms of how the police operates, because the military has not committed to remaining in the slums or occupying. So the main vacuum, the main capability gap that Rio has to resurrect the pacification strategy has not been tapped. So what the federal intervention has, perhaps rightly so, committed to doing is a sort of an operation to recover the police, to improve the training and try to restore the capabilities, the equipment. There are, very widespread reports of police cars being left in the bases because they don't have fuel, because they need repairing. So all of that is what the federal intervention committed to doing, they have not spent a lot of the money that was allocated to them by the federal government, but they have started the procurement process. So theoretically, they have had access to 1.2 billion reais, which broadly is 400, maybe less than that, 400 million US dollars, the equivalent of. And they have committed to spending just over 500 million reais. So it is a substantial investment in the equipment of the police, and it will have probably some effect in the long term. But the end of the federal intervention does not, unfortunately, or fortunately, change much in the dynamics, because the main problem remains the territorial control of the gangs and their ability to conduct this war among them and with the state. And this, as of now, with the state of the Rio finances, because of the economic decline in recent years, there isn't an obvious short-term solution for that.
More questions, please.
Kind of a related question to what we're just talking about. Nick Grove from Frontline Advisory. You described kind of a paradigm shift, let's say, in terms of the operational approach of the police and the military, from this incursion approach to a more community policing-oriented vision. And I'm wondering if you could speak to if or how the intelligence mindset shifted with that. It's a very different proposition to conduct an incursion than it is to actually be in a neighborhood. And as you're talking, and the times even line up, thinking about the American military in Iraq, 2007, 2008, making a very deliberate shift, much like this one, to a more community-oriented, locally engaged approach. And as we look to call it to death the end of this program, in terms of salvaging what was good in that, that kind of intelligence mindset can be something that's quite salvageable if it in fact exists. And I'm curious if you could speak to sort of the operational level view of how military and law enforcement see the problem, see the threat in these areas.
So, because we're talking about a state and a country where institutions are not as strong and stable as those of the United States, for instance. In Rio, the security institutions, they can vary in quality and in commitment from institution to institution. So one of the most heavily criticized security agencies in the whole of Brazil, I think, is the military police of Rio de Janeiro, because they have arrived. We are now at a point after so many decades of confrontation that it is a force that has been trained and have attracted people who are into this logic of military confrontation and this spirit of the skull with the knife through it. The heroes against killing the criminals in the slums. So this is something that when I went to 2015, I talked to the then head of the sort of chief of staff of the military police, and I talked to him again, and he's no longer there, but I talked to him in his capacity as an expert, and the leadership of the security institutions, both the military police and the security secretariat, have always been very clear that the force that they had in their hands, that the force that they had to operate with, was very lacking in capacity, in its ability to conduct traditional policing, including intelligence. So this leads to a deep suspicion towards the police by the local inhabitants. So I visited Maré, which is one of the slums in the north, near the island, in September. And the story I heard from the NGOs I visited was almost exclusively against the military police in terms of torture of people. There are some NGOs that have been set up there mainly to be sort of watchdogs of the police that operates there. So people come to them and they report, look, the police officers are torturing my cousin over there, and they run there and they try to negotiate with the police. That's what they told me, and it is backed up by some extensive reporting by the media. So because of this lack of stability in the security institutions, intelligence collection has been quite lacking. But it does have some centers of excellence. So, for instance, the prosecutor's office in Rio, the Ministério Público, is extremely well equipped and very good. They conduct some very good operations, and they are able to bring some drug lords and even powerful politicians to court and to extract convictions to some people. However, they can only operate. They can only do so much because some of these investigations take years. And a final example I will give is one of the main episodes of human rights abuses that led to the decline of the pacification, which was actually related to intelligence collection, although it was much cruder than that. So in 2014, there was a disappearance of a stonemason. He worked as a stonemason, Amarildo de Souza, and then a social media campaign. And he was last seen entering a UPP, entering a police base in Rio. And then this suspicion began that the police officers had killed him or led him somewhere. So a social media campaign and a Rio media campaign began, where is Amarildo? And later this was brought to court, and it was revealed that he was taken by the police because they thought that he knew something about a criminal suspect. He was tortured, and probably during this torture stage he was killed, perhaps accidentally, and his body was hidden somewhere. And so this had a devastating impact on the credibility of the pacification because it was conducted by the pacification force. So the trust. The state that we are in is actually at a stage before the phase in which the police would have acquired the intelligence capability it wanted. So the idea was that the pacification would create this trust with the communities, so that human intelligence would operate better. So what we are left with is still this very unstable division of labor between, very incompetent police base force and some centers of excellence. And there are many military police officers that are good, and some of these slums occupied by the police are actually operating quite well, and there is trust, etc. But overall, it is a very lacking police.
Thank you. We have one last question.
Yeah, I'm Liam, also with Moonshot CVE. So sort of going back to what you're saying about the violent far right, and it being sort of seen as a pushback against like the government's corruption and their incapacity to deal with violence. Is there a lot of crossover between the gangs and the vigilante groups? Is there a crossover between them and other sort of like marginalised extremist groups, or is it all, as we were saying, like are their intentions strictly commercial?
Mm-hmm.
So like in terms of how they try to sort of justify their actions, justify their movement. Just wanted to sort of hear your thoughts about any sort of ideological dynamics.
Yeah. It is an interesting question, because there was an ideological dimension at the origin of the Red Command. So it's entered into the annals of mythology of the criminal underworld in Brazil. That and there are creators of the founders of the Red Command that have been interviewed. And a good book on that is called Gangster Warlords by Iwan Grillo. It's he interviewed one of the founders of the Red Command. And basically the Red Command originated in a prison where some inmates were left-wing guerrillas imprisoned by the military regime that ruled Brazil between the 60s and the mid-80s. So goes the narrative that they learned some organizational techniques from these guerrillas, and the Red Command to this day has a foundational document that talks about the injustices of the state and the struggle of the poor against a militarized police or an abusive police force. And this is even stronger with the PCC in São Paulo, the first capital command that was created after a major massacre of inmates during a rebellion in one of the prisons there. And many experts argue that the PCC originated actually as a sort of a union, a trade union of inmates, of people in prison, to demand better conditions, better treatment. However, we should not overemphasize these. They are predominantly they are actually exclusively criminal, even though some of the founders may have had some ideas of organization and political organization taken from the guerrillas. Obviously, the militias have a sort of politics-related sort of narrative of justification for their activities, but they have also, transitioned to criminal activities. And there are reports of them cooperating with the gang sometimes, but it is a very unstable type of relationship.
And just to sort of build on, just to add that quickly, with the sort of the rise and the empowerment of sort of far-right groups, especially after the most recent election, like with neo-Nazi organisations, so with the rise of that right-wing ideological impetus, do you think that there is danger that the more sort of like extreme left wing of the origins of the PCC and the Great Command, do you reckon that will become more involved as well, and these conflicts might become more ideological in the future?
It is difficult to say, because there are rumors, and the rumors were spread by the campaign of Jair Bolsonaro, who explicitly said that there were involvement of some gangs in the attempted assassination that he suffered. So during the campaign, he was stabbed in a campaign rally, and he spent weeks in hospital out of campaign. And his campaign has said that there is involvement of criminal organizations there. It is not unimaginable that, given his promises to crack down on them. However, the greater risk that I see is, and it's something that several experts have told me in the September trip I did there, is actually the alignment of objectives between the government, the future government, and the militias, because they have a very similar ideological, or they have a very similar sort of proposition, which is the crackdown on the gangs, the establishment of order, the recovery of this weakening and decline of Rio towards a stronger, more the strong arm of the state and the law, sort of reaching the previously disorganized slums. So this vision is very similar between the two, and in the past we've had several cases of death squads being led by either former or off-duty police officers. And given the highly, how can I put it, highly aggressive discourse that we have seen from Bolsonaro and from Wilson Witzel, this sort of discourse can encourage these death squads to feel that they are free to do as they please. So many people are afraid that there will be a return of the death squads or an increase of the death squads, because unfortunately they haven't gone away completely.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Please.
Andrew Chief from ISS. Given the chaos and the situation on the ground, what three policy recommendations would you give to the state to deal with this situation?
So, first of all, there has to be a realization and the learning from the lessons learned from Latin America, and especially Colombia, I would say, which inspired the initial strategy of the pacification, that the development and the sort of human rights approach that some of these far-right politicians have so heavily criticized during the campaign, as saying that they are, defending the criminals, that they are, ignoring the plight of the victims, that this is actually an instrument towards security. So, I would urge them to learn the lessons from recent experiences in urban security in Latin America and elsewhere, that peace building and the arrival of the broader citizenship and state institutions to the previously marginalized areas is actually an instrument for security, and that the police cannot do anything. Even the world's most well-equipped police would not be able to constantly deal with the constant illicit criminality that arises in a cyclical manner in slums. So even if you repress it, it will appear somewhere else. So this whack-a-mole kind of approach to security is not working. And one of the main reasons for the decline of the pacification has been the lack of backup by other state institutions and civil society. And the state doesn't need to do anything. If it provides the conditions, a minimum state of condition, as it was the case in 2008, 9, 10, 11, lots and lots of civil society organizations went there. Prince William visited Rio, and he went to Maré, where I also went in a rather less high-profile visit earlier this year. And he visited one of such NGOs, which is actually established by a British citizen called Fight for Peace. And he, curiously, he has the other office of his NGO is actually in South London. So it's an example of how lessons from seemingly, hugely different cities or contexts can actually work to feed each other. So I think this element is very important as we move forward.
Thank you very much. So if there are no more questions, I would like to thank you very much all for attending and join me in thanking Antonio for his brilliant presentations and insights. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in our future events as well. Bye-bye.